Hello there, my name is Matthew Moore and I will be presenting to you today about H.G. Wells and how he has contributed to the eco-critical debates and ideas surrounding the environment and ecology, which is becoming a very, very even more so relevant issue in our current context. I'm currently a third year student at the University of Wolverhampton, and my supervisors are Professor Sebastian Gross and also Dr. Mark Jones, and I'm very fortunate to have them as my supervisors, guiding me and steering me with my research. I just want to spend a bit of time just quickly outlining my research really, and sort of where this has led me. So I want to just start off by saying that Wells has a huge body of work has been done on Wells, and he has been argued as exploring a range of anxieties surrounding degeneration, class complacency, the primitive, very Darwinian ideas. And there is some evidence out there by academics that demonstrates his ecological presence and his engagement with eco-criticism, but actually he has been overlooked, and many of the concepts that, with such as the Anthropocene, brown ecology aspects I'll be talking to you about in this paper, much of that he adumbrates and foresees. And this leads me on to my next point. He is very much a visionary, but actually one of the biggest visions that he did have in his fiction is surrounding the environment and mankind's relationship to that environment. I just want to quickly also talk to you about the debates surrounding Wells's fiction, surrounding my PhD research and what I'm going to be presenting to you today. And there is, eco-criticism has very much enlarged in response to the pollution and the contamination and the industry-sponsored biodisasters that have gone on and continue to go on in our society. There is an interesting set of ideas about the environment serving as a mere backdrop, and I wish to argue that actually Wells challenges that idea and shows that actually it has an active presence, and as Kaplan argues, it's no longer a passive object of the human gaze, and it does become a negative and active force. And we do see that in some of Wells's fiction, such as The Time Machine, for instance, where it is nature and that survives, but actually it's described in a very apocalyptic way, and that's also something I'll be talking about as part of this presentation. Also, Adam Trexler talks about how there is a shift from some fiction when it focuses on the environment and from this eco-critical perspective, that it means that the non-human shapes the narrative, and that we see less focus on characters. And again, we do see this happen in Wells's fiction, and we see his influence in terms of, if you think about Ballard and very close to Too Close for Comfort, we could say, with like Ballard's The Drought and the kind of situation we have with water supplies at the moment and so on. He very much again adumbrates those kind of ideas. As well, we see these kind of debates surrounding shallow ecology and deep ecology, and we do see Wells's fiction really show that nature, when threatened, will not serve mankind, and it will force itself, and it will try and break through and reverse the roles if it faces too much pressure. And I will argue and discuss that as well as part of this paper. And I do think in light of that, Wells does show more of a deep ecology perspective in terms of preserving nature and this idea of man, that nature has its own right to survive, and we do see nature fighting for that survival as well. And some other ideas as well that Wells does engage with and does very much adumbrate, such as Morton's the mesh, the idea of the interconnected nature of the species. We see that in a range of Wells's fiction. We only have to look at, for instance, The War of the Worlds, and we see that actually the interconnected nature of life forms doesn't just exist within our planet, but across the solar system. And also, if you think about the time machine, time and space as well. Also this idea as well, such as Karen Barrad's the concept of interactions, the way in which we're all entangled as a species, and Wells is very much engages with this and adumbrates these kind of ideas. On the next slide you can see that I've put some of the texts that I'm really engaging with as part of my research, and I'll be talking a bit about these in a short while. So just very quickly, sort of how does Wells adumbrate issues surrounding the post-human condition? Well, we do see this idea very much at the forefront of Wells's fiction, that actually the species is intermeshed with a range of other life forms, and actually that the species is plural, and that there is a fragmented the boundaries between what makes animal, human and machine are actually very fragmented. And if we think about the War of the Worlds, in the War of the Worlds we see evidence of that, where machine and the Martians within their machines are organic life forms. Very much obviously one of the central ideas is the concept of the Anthropocene that I'm really interested in at this present time, and I could go on for a very long time about this, but the Anthropocene, obviously we know, is talking about the human footprint and the impact that it's having on the environment. We see much evidence of the Anthropocene in Wells's fiction, and I will be talking a bit more about that later in this presentation. But again, we see how the humanities is depicted as really changing the face of the planet, and again a concept that that Wells has not been acknowledged as engaging with by academics. And again, the concept surrounding man as the measure of all things, Wells really does take hold of that idea, and very much challenges that perception that man is not the measure of all things, and actually we should be looking to nature as the example that really does, that we should be looking towards. Some other ideas I've just talked about, sort of the dark ecological thought and the mesh, but also the idea of the stranger, the idea that actually there are things that are living with us now, and actually the idea that humanity is their own enemy. And again we see that in Wells's fiction, and I'll be sharing that, some ideas about that in the course of this presentation. As alongside that, I'm very interested in this idea by Timothy Morton about hyper-objects, and again also Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence and violence that occurs gradually. And I think if we just take the time machine as an example, in there we see how at the beginning of the time machine, the time traveller is in his own comfortable existence with his gentlemanly friends, surrounded by wonderful, luxurious items, not having to worry. They've had a cosy, comfortable meal, and they're worried about, obviously, the time traveller about to trick him and so on. But within that chapter he's comfortable, he's at ease, there's nothing bothering him. But by the time he goes to the end point in time, we see the consequences of those kind of actions. We see this, and I think Wells is really trying to show us how if we don't alter in the present and take note of what we're doing through things like the Industrial Revolution at the time, then this destruction will occur, and this delayed destruction will be felt to such a point that we won't be able to stop it, and it will become irreversible, which in our present context we are feeling today. As well, I've talked about brown ecology already, about that we are a mixture of entities, and I think Wells does show that, and I think even if we look to the Martians, that they are organic and technology integrated as well. I think we've got that to consider as well. And I really think Gould's vision on the fourth bullet point on my slide really sets the scene, really, that we are a complex assemblage of living and non-living elements, and Wells does show that it doesn't matter, just because we are labelled human doesn't mean to say that we're not a mixture of something else. And I think we do see that in the body of his fiction. If we look at the Time Machine, the Eloy and the Morlocks, yes, they are upper and lower in terms of where they are situated in the future time, but deep down they are assembled the same. And this idea that Gould stresses that we must rethink ourselves as ecological beings, that is very much at the heart of Wells's fiction. He's very keen to show that we are not separate entities that can just exist independently from other life forms. We are part of the same ecosystem. So this leads me now to thinking about sharing with you some of my findings about the entangled bank. And I wanted to sort of expand on this very much by saying that Wells was, I think it's very clear to see that there is evidence of Wells's interest in Darwinian ideas relevant to 19th century writers, but we do see how Wells does show this idea that we have an entangled ecosystem, linking on to obviously some of the ideas that Gould notes, much text that engage from an eco-critical lens deal with. So I just mentioned about Darwin's ideas, and this is where I took the idea of the entangled bank from. And some examples here that I wanted to share with you. So in The War of the Worlds we have the imagery of the motif of the red weed, and it does consume the whole of humanity and the structures of humanity. But we do see a give and take, and we do see a lot like a tug of war. The red weed initially shrouds the planet, and then by the end we do see that the actual terrestrial plants reverse it round. And I think this again shows you this kind of tug of war that seems to take place between humanity and nature, but there must be that kind of harmonious relationship if we are to move forward in the present and survive as a species. One of the most pivotal and one of the most poignant depictions, I think, in all of Wells's fiction, it comes from the last chapter of The Time Machine, before he actually goes back in the epilogue, of where we see when he arrives in future time and discovers that there's nothing left, and that all that there is there is, as in this passage that I've selected, there is a desolate slope, there's huge white butterflies, there's a monstrous crab-like creature. What we see here is his kind of resentment of one species surviving over another. I think it's also very interesting that we have this description of a metallic front, perhaps again symbolising, representing these kind of ideas surrounding the human and sort of anticipating the post-human in the same way as the Martians that we see in the War of the Worlds. another passage I just wanted to quickly share with you as well, but again we've got the description of them being monsters again, the fact they're apparitions, they're trying to crawl towards him. Again, we see this kind of realisation that if we don't accept that we are part of the same ecosystem, then it will lead to our destruction, and we do see this. And then I think this is another really interesting passage as well, but we do see that this pattern of red, and I do think this is almost, again, Wells suggesting that if we don't embrace this kind of, the idea of being, as Gold puts it, ecological beings, then we will have blood on our hands, and there will be species death. And we do see this, the kind of apocalypse, the apocalyptic descriptions. And it's also very interesting that the time traveller doesn't really seem to have learnt anything, in the sense that we do see these kind of ecophobic descriptions, such as them being described as monsters, being described as, things, being dehumanised, which is a pattern that we see across Wells's fiction when it comes to nature. And again, Wells is really demonstrating that we must move away from these ecophobic descriptions or tendencies. If we are to survive as a species, we must accept that we are not at the heart of all things. Again, I think the last passage here about the fact that the darkness grew apace, the sort of anticipation of entropy, and I think what Wells is really trying to say here is that actually if we do not accept our interconnected nature, then obviously it will only accelerate entropy, it will only accelerate our own destruction as a species. But in particular, what I'm quite interested in this passage here is the listing of man, sheep, the birds, the insects, and the fact that you've got that kind of equality there within Wells's writing, very much demonstrating the idea that actually the actions of one life form influences another, which leads me on very much to my next bit about, again, that in the island of Dr. Moreau, for instance, they are described as the plasticity of living forms, the idea that actually we are mouldable, there isn't a set structure, and there are tons of references to the idea of tangled species, and again these patterns of being tangled together all demonstrate this idea of entanglement within Wells's fiction. Moving on, which lends me quite onto my next section, is this idea of the human footprint in Wells's fiction. And very much so we see the human footprint at work in Wells's fiction, and I'm going to share some of my findings with you now. John Parham, in his influential study, The Cambridge Companion to the Anthropocene, very much defines what we know about the Anthropocene. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I just wanted to share the last bit of what he was saying, is that literature can help us live in that future, and I think that really does sum up what Wells is doing and did do with his fiction. He helps us see, he gives us visions to show us what we can do and what we shouldn't do and what we should change in order to survive as a species. And I think as well, Parham notes that sometimes fiction has been branded as ill-equipped to deal with the Anthropocene, but actually Wells breaks that tradition, and he does take us away from these conventional descriptions of human scale, households, workplaces, villages, all of those kind of things. He takes those away and he transports us into settings that take us out of our own comfort zone. For instance, the time traveller going far into the future, for instance, is a really significant one there. So again, Wells is very, very key in showing us the role of the environment and the impact it has, and the impact that humanity has on the environment. I wanted to share this passage from you, from The World Set Free, and again I think just the depictions in terms of the fact that they're external, they have external power. Man is tool using but a fire making animal, and I think the oxymoronic description of them being exploitative but also animalistic does show very much that the Anthropocene is exploiting but equally beast-like, and this idea that yes, they're entangled but they're also causing their own damage to their own ecosystems in the process. This passage comes from the opening chapter of The War of the Worlds, and again the description of the Martians about how they that no one would have believed that the species was being watched and scrutinised and studied, as it describes in the opening paragraph of the novel. But we get these references to what humanity has done with the Tasmanians, with the dodo that we get referred to as well. And again, this is demonstrating again the dangers of the Anthropocene era and the consequences that it's doing to the species and other life forms as well. Another passage from In the Abyss, by obviously again a short story, but again the description here of we should be known to them as strange meteoric creatures, and in this story, in this short story, there is a species underwater, as it were, and the idea of them being sort of the humanity being like the stars in their sky, but the description of them being of things falling catastrophically dead out the blackness of their watery sky, I think really does show this idea that humanity is almost like the equivalent of a storm, wreaking damage and damage to other species as well. I think there's also that kind of religious kind of reading that you can have that's at play here as well, almost like humanity as a godlike omniscient force, bringing things down to into their habitat. But I also think it's also Wells very much being a visionary again, very much showing us how one species can inadvertently affect another, and we do see that here. And we get the description of sometimes sinking things and crush them, and these verbs with crushing them demonstrates the kind of impact that we're seeing with humanity towards other life forms as well. So I think what I've tried to do at this point is show you some snippets, really some short passages where we see Wells's influence, and we see him engaging very much with the ideas surrounding the Anthropocene, surrounding the idea of entanglement as well. So in summary, I think it's very clear that Wells plays a very instrumental role in shaping the trajectory of fiction surrounding the environment and surrounding ecocriticism, and we do see that he has a very, very clear function in sort of shaping the journey that follows with it. And I think we can see much influence in the works of, for instance, Ballard. We see much of the kind of similar kind of ideas paralleled in his work as well. So Wells does really, I argue, sets the blueprint, what many others build upon as well. And I have talked about this as part of my research in my thesis, but very much if we just think about, for instance, Doctor Who, If we think about Doctor Who and the Silurians, there is a very similar depiction of the kind of Anthropocene that we see within Wells's fiction. The Green Death deals with the kind of environmental disasters that Wells pretty much preempted and sort of envisioned. So it's very clear that Wells, although aligned as dealing with a variety of Victorian anxieties, it's clear that he did have a fundamental part to play in shaping the genre. And when reading this, I think as a whole it really does demonstrate the important role that literature serves today, and hopefully will continue to do so in the forms that it mutates into. It really does. There is an environment in them all, and I think it really does demonstrate to us the important role that literature has in terms of showing and revealing what humankind is doing to the natural world. And I think hopefully as we go forward, the more people that read texts and engage with eco-criticism, the more these messages will pass through. And I did want to sort of end by sharing this poem that I stumbled across by accident as part of my research, but I'm so glad I did, because I really think it does set up again and demonstrate some of the ideas that Wells was pretty much adumbrating, and Atwood, a brilliant writer in every respect. And you can see again the same kind of ideas that Wells had anticipated flow through into the works of Atwood, and you can see that influence travelling through over time. And I think it's very interesting that it starts off with this idea of, as a species, many years of hard work, and the belief that we own it, but actually it was always the other way round. That end point, I think, of that poem is really very much summarises the view that Wells takes, and actually we are an entangled species, and regardless of our viewpoint, we must accept that we are ecological beings and that one species doesn't dominate the other. So thank you so much for listening to my talk today, and I do hope that you have found this useful as well, and I am happy to share any other research on Wells if I can. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Bye.